Welcome to Massey Dialogues. Bienvenue. My name is Nathalie Desrosiers and I'm the principal of Massey College. Today we're going to have a good discussion on my favorite subject, the role of the arts, the way in which our cultural policies need to change in Canada. And we're going to talk a little bit about changes being led by women in museums. So I want to say, first of all, welcome to everyone to join us again at Massey Dialogues. This is a forum for discussion among generations and with our senior fellows of communities and our community to address the issues of the day. Massey Dialogue is brought to you from Massey College, which is located on Indigenous land, the land of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and the Mississaugas of the Credit. It is a treaty land of the Mississaugas of the Credit, and I want to acknowledge our duty of stewardship toward this land and the great privilege that we have to continue to do our work here. Today's dialogue is the brainchild of a new senior fellow at Massey College, Zena Vergy, and she's going to be moderating this discussion. Zainab is a laureate of the 2020 Governor General's Award for Outstanding Contribution to the Visual and Media Art. She is also a McGill-Queens College Fellow, a Mentor to Canada Action Fellow, and she's the Executive Director of Galerie Ontario, Ontario Galleries. And she's been a thoughtful commentator, someone who has contributed to the international instruments on culture, such as the status of artists and cultural diversity. And she's also been really instrumental in building the British Columbia Arts Council. So we're so delighted to have her with us. She'll be accompanied by two women from Ottawa that I'm so happy to welcome at Massey, and I hope that we'll have occasion to see them and welcome them in person someday. Diana Nemiroff is an author. She's the former curator of contemporary and modern art at the National Gallery of Canada, she's the director of the Carleton University Art Gallery. She is an adjunct professor at University of Ottawa and at Carleton as well. She was herself as well the laureate of the Governor General's Award for Exceptional Contribution to the Visual and Media Arts in 2012. And she is the author of a book that made the list of the best book from the Hill Times. It's called Women at the Helm, how Jean Sutherland Boggs, Hsio-yen, Shih, and Shirley Thompson changed the National Gallery of Canada. So we'll hear a little bit about her book later in this conversation. And finally, we are joined by Alexandra Badzak. And I know Alexandra because I've seen her work. She is the director, the chief executive officer of the Ottawa Art Gallery. She's been working on this project. She led the expansion of the Ottawa Art Gallery that finally opened in 2018. I had the privilege of representing the Ottawa Vanier at that time where the Ottawa Art Gallery is located. And I can testify to the fact that it is a transformative institution, transformative for the city, for the neighborhood, and I think for Canada as well. She's also an adjunct professor at University of Ottawa, president of the Canadian Art Museum Directors Organization. She's a member of the International Women's Forum and the Association of Art Museum Directors. She is a recipient of the Royal Canadian Academy of Arts Medal, and she has really been quite present in arguing for protection and for arts. I've seen her at the Standing Committee on Canadian Heritage a couple of times. So without further ado, I'm going to pass the mic to Zainab to lead us in this wonderful conversation. Welcome to Massey.
Thank you. Thank you, Natalie, for your kind words and also providing us this platform to discuss this immensely critical book by Diana. And, this book brings together the contentious politics of the time, the making of a new home for the National Gallery, of course, the defining moments of women leadership, and, of course, the history of cultural institutions, public literacy of art, and most importantly, the story of Canadian art. It is a braided narrative that keeps the focus on three women and the story of the institution. Seldom we come across a scholarly work in the cultural history of institutions, especially cultural institutions, and it is a wonderful portrait of the National Gallery of Canada. We hope that our conversation can cull some themes that emerge from the book and can do justice to the braided narrative and the complexity of the times. So, Diana, let me begin with the obvious question. What made you write the book? What kind of urgency did you feel that you had to address?
Well, I don't think it was necessarily a sense of urgency so much as in the first place, when I retired from my position as director of the Carleton University Art Gallery, I, I began thinking about writing a book, and I wanted the book to be, in a way, a homage to Shirley Thompson. I had worked under Shirley at the National Gallery for 10 years, the full 10 years of her mandate, and I had a tremendous amount of admiration for her. We became friends. Um, so that was my first motivation. The second really was to address the question of women in power in cultural institutions. This is really at the heart of the feminist project to examine the whole history of women's relationship to power, because for most of the modern world, women have been excluded from power. And that's true also of cultural institutions. Jean Boggs, the first figure in my narrative, when she became director of the National Gallery in 1966, she was the first woman anywhere to have to direct a national gallery anywhere in the world. So it was a landmark. And I plunged myself into this research in the archives of the National Gallery, but also the public archives of Canada. It was an amazing experience, actually.
All right, lovely. Maybe tell us a little bit more about, we'll come back to these three protagonists that are in your book, and I'm sure we'll hear more about them. Alex, at the Ottawa Art Gallery, you led the charge, as we heard, on the gallery expansion project, one of the most important cultural infrastructure projects in Ottawa for a generation, which opened in 2018. As a woman at the helm of another important Ottawa cultural institution, how do you situate yourself or perceive this narrative arc that Diana has built?
Thank you. Yes, and thank you again for inviting me to be part of this discussion. I have to say it's quite an honor to be in a forum with three amazing women, Natalie, Zainab, and Diana. Uh, and I guess when I reflect on these amazing leaders within the National Gallery and Diana's book, I recognize the incredible path that they have paved for us, and I think it's very easy to forget how challenging it was to be a women leader at the helm, most especially of a national institution, and that we and all the success of women within positions of power have to thank them for the incredible work that they did to pave and open doors for the rest of us. And so, I think it's very interesting when I even reflect back on the 10-year period that I have been at the helm of the Ottawa Art Gallery. And I will say that the Ottawa Art Gallery, unlike many other institutions across Canada, has been consistently women-led, a little bit of a younger organization, but we've had three amazing, well, I suppose I include myself, so I shouldn't say amazing, two amazing female directors before me. And, in the 10 years that I've been there, I've certainly seen a bit of arc and a change that has occurred within the environment that I've had to operate, and could recognize a lot of the kind of issues, challenges, opportunities that Diana's book revealed with the women leaders of the National Gallery, and even within the expansion project. when I began, it was in an environment that I think didn't allow for a lot of support. I think I was, one could say that there was an expectation of failure. There weren't a lot of other women who were leading infrastructure projects at the time. And when I did go to seek, support or insight from some of my male cohorts, I would say it was often in a situation of a lot of bravado and not necessarily a safe space to share some of the challenges. But what I did recognize and what resonated for me in the stories of the three women who led the National Gallery was in a lot of ways their workman-like approach to the work ahead. I mean, they saw what the role of the National Gallery was at that moment in time, and then they strategically moved their institutions forward through it. And what was, I think, most remarkable is they took everyone with them, right? So that it was a shared concept, it was a shared narrative that people felt like they were part of that process. And I certainly relate to that work, and certainly appreciate how challenging that is as well. And I guess most especially, I really relate to their dogged, passionate belief in these very unique institutions called art galleries and museums, and they're the particular and an important role they play in civil society.
Wonderful, wonderful. I'll just go back to Diana for a moment. Diana, I just think it might be really interesting to tell us a little bit briefly about the three protagonists that you've written about. Just sort of to sum up, sort of the women at leadership, women at the helm.
Gladly, gladly. Well, one of the first things that I found out were the fact that all three, when they were directors of the National Gallery, were unmarried. In those days, even though it wasn't really that long ago, a period from about the mid-60s to the end of the 90s, being married and occupying one of these top positions, this isn't just the cultural world, obviously, were considered incompatible for women, obviously not incompatible for men, and therein lies an important difference. Another thing that they shared was that they all had doctorates. In fact, Jean Boggs was the first director of the National Gallery to have that qualification. They had all traveled a lot, and they were all aware of the international context within which the National Gallery is situated, international trends. Boggs and Thomson were both born in lived, I should say, in small Ontario towns. I had to qualify that because Boggs was actually born in Peru, where her geologist father was working for Imperial Oil at the time. But all through, and of course, Shih was born in China. She was this daughter of a prominent diplomat. And they all traveled. Jean went to study at Harvard. Shirley Thompson went to Paris first as an au pair before she found work in the international cultural and policy sector. And Shih moved with her family from country to country because of her father's postings. So they all had a very wide, I would say, a wide experience of the world. Boggs and Shih both had very strong academic backgrounds and museum backgrounds. They had museum experience and a lot of teaching experience. But Thomson distinguishes herself from them by her background in international cultural policy, and the university sector. But she was a self-declared museum rat. She absolutely adored museums. So each of them had to sort of size up the challenges of the particular moment in time at which they arrived. For Boggs, it really was moving the National Gallery, improving its profile, moving it onto the international stage, getting international awareness for its work, and making its work worthy of international awareness, really strengthening the whole research function of the museum, hiring new staff, hiring librarians, really transforming it into a modern museum. And of course, as we know, one of the most important things for her was she quickly identified that a new building was essential. The gallery, when she arrived, was housed in an office building on Elgin Street that was very unsuitable for its functions. By the time that Shih arrived in the mid 70s, the cultural landscape had shifted. The government had adopted a multiculturalism project, which was official, and Shih understood her mandate as being to open up the National Gallery to Canada's cultural communities, to make the gallery's programs and acquisitions more reflective of the cultural landscape of the country. As for Thomson, she arrived as the building was being completed, and also as just a little bit before legislation was passed to create the Crown Corporation, which the gallery now is, which gave it a great deal of autonomy. So she had to sort of forge a new administrative identity for the country. But she also had a very strong interest in education, and her belief was that the museum was an educational instrument of importance. So that was one of the major projects she gave herself.
That's fantastic. And actually, that gives me, I want to introduce this idea of the instrument of culture. The National Gallery of Canada is an instrument of culture and is governed by two pieces of legislation: the Museums Act and the Financial Administration Act. And there is an assumption that cultural activities of great significance to the character and value of our very way of life, and in fact to the survival of a distinctive Canadian society. So to Alex, when the Canadian Constitution is ambivalent on this idea of culture, and I've spoken about this previously on this whole thing, how do we make sense of a cultural institution as an instrument of culture? What are your thoughts on that? Just a couple of minutes.
Right. I mean, it's such a huge topic. I guess it really could dominate this entire conversation. And I guess, the way that I maybe could think about it in a way that we could talk about it in a couple of minutes is I'm very interested in ICOM, which of course is the International Council of Museums struggle to find a new definition of museum. So right now we're in this nebulous space where we actually don't have a proper definition of what museums are, across the globe. And we're coming from a period of time where language like museums acquire, conserve, research, exhibit for education and enjoyment. We're now moving to language like museums are democratizing polyphonic spaces for critical dialogue and contribute to human dignity, social justice, global equality, and planetary well-being. So really kind of very big shifts that are occurring. And so when I think about culture and museums as instruments of culture within a nation, I have to think of how important those definitions are, because definitions like that make their way into policies, and policies affect the way that we operate our physical spaces. And so for a gallery director, that starts to say to me that shifts need to occur in the way that I allocate resources towards staffing, towards acquisitions, towards even the way that we design the spaces that we exhibit in. And so, maybe as a small example of that is what I'm seeing as the very active shift that's occurring within the role of curator. Where before, it was very research expertise within, art history, or medium expertise, we're now starting to ask of museum curators to be conveners, to be community conveners, to be really adept at cultural consultation. That sort of objectivity that used to be so present within their work is now shifting to one that values subjectivity, where they're embedding themselves within the narratives that they construct. So that to me is just one example of kind of the shifts that are occurring, how it trickles down into affecting the way that we can kind of run our cultural institutions. And ultimately, for me, I look at it and I see that these are shifting sands, right? I mean, as cultural institutions, we need to build an ability to respond to the changes that are occurring, and move away from what was probably a fairly monolithic, permanent, immutable concept of museums to one that embraces change.
I think that's you made some really great points there, and you know, and how we've had to evolve and respond to certain political things. But Diana, beyond the constitutional ambivalence on culture, I think the political leadership often doesn't understand art or cultural institutions for that matter. And of course, I've spoken and written on this, and recently, I believe Kate Taylor in the Globe and Mail alluded to this in the context of the pandemic. In your assessment, how did each of the three women address the National Gallery as an instrument of culture?
Well, first of all, if I could just preface my comments, I was listening to Alex and thinking about my own experience. And I think that, and Alex quite rightly reminds us of where we are now culturally, especially with respect to museums. There are other things, of course, that tend to not change. Museums are open structures in the sense that unlike universities, you do not have to enroll, you do not have to become a member. You probably have to pay a fee to enter, but many museums have open hours where there is no fee required. So they are rather unique in their educational mandate. And they were, in the 19th century, considered to be dual instruments, on the one hand of education and on the other hand of entertainment. And in many ways, they reflect that dual nature today. Through almost any museum I can think of has an exhibition program. And those exhibitions connect viewers to contemporary artistic production, but also to historic work, and moreover to the art of, depending on the museum, different cultures, different parts of the world, in a very tangible way, through objects, through the representation of objects. This is incredibly important. Curators in the museum provide audiences with the tools that they might need in order to interpret what are often unfamiliar material. So the exhibitions may delight us, but they also inform us. In addition, collections are extremely important to museums, and through their collections, museums are keepers of history and cultural memory. And this is one of the areas where they shift constantly, as well as exhibitions. The themes of exhibitions tend to be more topical. They tend to reflect current interests. Well, so do collections, except that they're cumulative. And so we see the changing evolution of concerns in the collection. What are we? In the case of the National Gallery, for example, you spoke, Zainab, about the ambivalence of culture in the Constitution, and our Constitution considers culture a provincial matter, unlike, for example, the military or taxation. Well, no, I shouldn't say that about taxation, obviously. But museums are very much in touch with with trends. And so when Jean entered the picture, to focus now, she was mostly concerned with professionalizing the National Gallery based upon her experience, largely in the United States, in the northeastern United States, the kinds of museums that she was familiar with: the Art Institute of Chicago, the Metropolitan Museum of Art, the Museum of Modern Art. And she was interested. One of the things that she did very early on was to hire a number of francophone curators and to expand the capacity to study Canada's art from the Ancien Régime, when it was still a part of France, a French colony. And in that respect, she was reflecting a cultural consideration, because this was the era of Trudeau and the biculturalism acts and so forth. So that was significant for her. Shih, as I've already mentioned, brought the art of Asia into the National Gallery. And it's still there, although at the present time sort of hidden. But she made a very important acquisition of South Asian art very shortly after she arrived, and found a donor, a very wealthy donor, to give it to the gallery, because even at the time it was worth millions. And that established the basis for enlarging a collection of a part of the world that had been underrepresented, but was strongly represented in the Canadian diaspora. So Shirley, I think, was much more interested in giving the curators the opportunity to realize their research. And so her period as director was a period of some extraordinary exhibitions. For example, Jean Boggs's Degas exhibition. The European curators did series of international collaborations with, when I refer to the European curators, I mean of European art, with the Metropolitan Museum of Art and the Réunion des Musées Nationaux in France and so forth. So it really was a period when the National Gallery was becoming a big boy. But at the same time, it was also a period when the National Gallery was becoming much more conscious of Indigenous art and artists, and the necessity of representing their work in the collection and in their exhibitions. And Shirley was very much behind that.
That's fantastic. Actually, that brings me really to a theme that's very dear to my heart, and has definitely been part of my experience of being in the art and culture sector in Canada. And you know, I've worked very diligently in this area, but you know, it's really the theme of the challenge of diversity, race, non-Eurocentric practices in cultural institutions. And I think that in this instance, you know, Shih becomes very interesting. And I think that during her tenure, you know, Shih's challenge was in those tumultuous times of the 70s and 80s. It's worth a second look. And I'm really talking about that contested reception of the Royal Commission on the Status of Women, especially how the report kind of erased, in a way, the objective realities and lives of racialized women in Canada. And there was the UN Declaration in 1971, which was the International Year to Combat Racism and Racial Discrimination. And Diana, you were active in this period, also working on Chinese women's labor. I was working with Sarah Diamond on the BC women's labor history, later co-founded and co-directed Invisible Colors, which really was addressing and you know, this contestation that was emerging from the Royal Commission. So, you know, Diana, I think there's a sense of a déjà vu when one reads in between the lines of the contentious tenure of Shih. You know, and how do we understand this in today's social crisis, where race and difference are again foregrounded in the public and political imagination, and cultural institutions are, you know, its sort of critical sites? Any take on that?
Yes. Hsieh's appointment was a very interesting one, and it did more or less coincide with the adoption of a multicultural policy on the part of the federal government. And certainly, when her appointment was announced, the press at the time was all over her because she was an icon, a symbol of that multiculturalism that Canada was. Official Canada was becoming aware of, and which had, I think, probably achieved a significant enough cultural mass to claim a position. Unluckily for Shih, she happened to arrive at a point when resources were becoming much more scarce. And her brief tenure, she was director of the National Gallery for only 4.5 years compared to 10 years for each of Boggs and Thomson, is a sign of the frustrations that she felt, and that she experienced, and she experienced them with very little support. She did not have, for the most part, the support of the older, established National Gallery staff. They didn't know what to make of her sort of academic, hands-off style, where she sort of felt, okay, you curators, you know your research areas, and I don't need to interfere, and I'll do the administration. Jean had a more hands-on administrative approach, very consultative. Shih tended, she had a brilliant mind, and she tended to sort of look at situations and quickly assess what could be done. So she got very little support from the enabling environment, and by the enabling environment, what I'm thinking of are the political environment. The concern of the politicians of the day was mainly with separatism. This was the mid-70s. They were concerned with the recession, so there were negative economic circumstances. Shih endured multiple cutbacks in the budget of the National Gallery, almost making it impossible to hold a proper centenary for the gallery in 1980. She did a very good job nonetheless. But her hands were tied in many ways. And because she was an outsider to Ottawa and an outsider to the political establishment, and I believe also because of an unconscious racism, maybe sometimes it was conscious, but we'll give them the benefit of the doubt, the political establishment was not particularly behind her. She forged on, but what really broke her spirit, I think, was the struggle over the new building, because there had been a competition. Shih came in right when the competition was taking place. She was on the jury that selected the winning project. And when the Minister of Communications, John Roberts, announced the winner, he almost immediately in the same space sort of backed off government action, as in, well, we've had the competition, but don't expect us to actually build a building. And so before long, there she was, finding herself on a panel looking at what existing federal properties could actually be transformed into a new building. And she just saw herself going around in circles in a no building, no resources. And she decided that this wasn't the right place for her. She went on and had a very successful academic career at the University of Hong Kong in Hong Kong.
Terrific. And just to finish off on this, I think I do want to point to this sort of interesting tension that you already have sort of alluded to and have brought up. But I think, in the book, on page 158, where you've highlighted the landscape tradition that brought Chinese and Nova Scotian folk art side by side, to elicit quotes, the universality of the figure in the landscape theme, and thereby sort of juxtaposing the elite Eurocentric landscape versus the peoples, to sort of borrow from Barry Lord's The History of Painting in Canada Towards a People's Art. Obviously, I'm paraphrasing quite a few pages. In light of this, we see further Shih talk about the role of the public institution and to consider the diversity of tradition that informs contemporary art and society. And given all of this context, in your estimation, why is Shih termed as politically naive?
Well, I don't think she had a very good take on the political environment. I don't, let's not forget that there was a layer of bureaucracy between her and the Minister of Heritage, and that was the National Museums Corporation. So she did not have very much direct contact with the minister. I think if I remember correctly, she'd only met with him perhaps once in her whole 4.5 years. That's not much. Um, and Ottawa's a kind of a strange environment. She didn't know the right people. Um, it's it's a very segmented environment where there's the political establishment on the one part, there's the academic establishment, and then there's the cultural sphere.
Right.
And she stayed within her sphere. She 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 had difficulty networking in Ottawa. Toronto was the place where she knew people and was more successful in that regard. So, with respect to the exhibitions that you're referring to, it was actually a trio of exhibitions because she brought in an exhibition which was being circulated by the People's Republic of China of peasant painting. And this was to illustrate, the paintings illustrated life essentially in the countryside. Um, and that was what she paired up with the Nova Scotia folk art painting. So she wanted to make an argument for what's sometimes called the people's art, sometimes called naive painting. And she got caught up in a kind of a battle in the media between Robert Fulford and who was the critic for the I forget whether it was the Globe and Mail or the Star at the time, and Barry Lord, who went on to write a sort of Maoist almost history of painting in Canada. Barry Lord completely got the idea of the people's art and was very, very pro that. Fulford couldn't get his head around the idea that there was a place for such work, even though, to go back to the landscape question, Shih had also at the same time organized an exhibition of Chinese landscape painting, which could be linked to the landscape traditions in the European galleries and the Canadian galleries, to show, the sophistication of the Chinese tradition and
Yeah.
to, show these different kinds of approaches to the same subject, essentially. But unfortunately, although the exhibitions were very successful with the public, the critics had to stake their familiar ground and basically turn it back to what should the National Gallery be doing. And even though the public apparently enjoyed what Shih was doing, the critics were either, let's do more of it, or no, we have to protect the National Gallery and its high art traditions from.
Correct. Yeah. I want to just go back though, because I think the whole sort of you brought up this sort of the politics and the political environment quite a bit.
Mhm.
I want to introduce the last theme. Just looking at the time, I think just very quickly to introduce just this theme of the arm's length. The 80s was a period when the issue of arm's length became a really political hot potato, and we saw that during the tenure of Shih, and it came up, it came up very much at Porteous, who was then the director at the Council for the Arts, took this challenge head on a result which, and he was basically not reappointed. But this issue of arm's length is it was definitely an issue, and I think to this date something we hold very dear and fight for. But Diana, Boggs found the new National Museum Corporation Act sort of taking away her deputy minister equivalent status in a way, right? And direct access to the federal minister.
Right.
What stands out for you among these three fabulous women who best understood the imperative of autonomy of the cultural institution? I think at this theme, after this, we'll move on to your reading.
Well, I think that Boggs resisted it all the way. She resisted the National Museums Corporation, this new layer of bureaucracy. She resisted the loss of autonomy. She attempted even writing to the Prime Minister of the day, that was at the beginning, Lester Pearson, explaining to him how problematic it was to try to remove the director from the high level administrative work entailed in being the director of a major cultural institution. And she resigned because she could not penetrate the bureaucracy, and she resisted it. Shih attempted to work with the bureaucracy, but as I have tried to sketch out, got very little support from them. Their masters were the politicians. They weren't working for the galleries. The National Museums was also part of this. I would say that therefore that it was Shirley Thompson who was the most aware of the arm's length principle, because it was enshrined in the new legislation of the Museum Act in 1990, that there was to be no interference, no political interference into the artistic activities of the institution. And that essentially meant the collections and the exhibitions. And she defended it most notably and very notoriously in the case of the acquisition of Voice of Fire, where she had to defend it in the public realm, but she also had to defend it to Parliament. And she addressed she had some supporters, but the conservative backbenchers were very much in the enemy camp. You'll remember Felix Holtman, the pig farmer from Manitoba. And she convinced them that they didn't have a legal leg to stand on. So she really used the legal force of the act to protect the gallery and its decisions in matters concerning its core mandate, its artistic activities.
Terrific. I think now we should move on to you doing your reading, Diana. Probably a good enough segue, and then so that we can have, a little bit of time for some Q&A at the end. So I'm going to pass it on back to you, and we look forward to you reading from the book.
Thank you. I'll begin with a quote from researchers Michelle K. Ryan and S. Alexander Haslam, which appears at the beginning of the book's conclusion. And then I'll read from the end of that chapter, which addresses their research in relation to the subjects of my book. The quote, "Women's participation in social life is greater than ever before, with women undertaking paid work and occupying middle management positions at unprecedented levels and engaging in the political process at equal or often better rates than men. However, it appears that a final male bastion remains, those positions at the pinnacle of power, influence, and leadership. Importantly, while in the final decades of the 20th century, we saw reasonably dramatic gains toward gender equality, of late, the representation of women in senior organizational ranks has stagnated and in some cases even declined. Today, a woman is again at the helm of the National Gallery, 21 years after Shirley Thompson left to direct the Canada Council of the Arts. Sasha Suda, a former curator of European art at the AGO, took the reins at the gallery in April 2019. She holds a record of her own in the gallery's history as the first married woman with young children to become its director. More surprising for its lack of precedent is the fact that a month before Suda's arrival in Ottawa, another woman, Kaywin Feldman, the former director of the Minneapolis Institute of Art, became the first woman director in the history of the National Gallery of Art in Washington, D.C. Back in Ottawa, women direct 3 of the 5 national museums in the nation's capital at this time. Besides the National Gallery, Meg Beckel has directed the Canadian Museum of Nature since 2011, succeeding Joanne de Cosimo in the role, and Lisa Leblanc became Director General of the Museum of Science and Technology in October 2018. Further afield, Maria Balsha has directed the Tate Gallery in London since 2017 in an otherwise predominantly male landscape in London museums. These are significant signs that obstacles to the advancement of women are falling at the highest levels, especially in the English-speaking world. However, in spite of this positive trend, there is mounting evidence that once appointed to top positions, women are likely to face greater scrutiny and criticism, and to be evaluated less favorably than their male counterparts. Ryan and Haslam coined the term the glass cliff in 2005 to describe the phenomenon whereby women who have broken through the glass ceiling tend to find that their positions of leadership are associated with greater risk of failure. If and when that failure occurs, it is then women rather than men who must face the consequences and who are singled out for criticism and blame. In looking at the factors that influence these negative outcomes, Ryan and Haslam find that implicit theories of management and gender play a powerfully prescriptive role in the way that women are evaluated, even when their behavior is similar to men's. However, such theories are both dynamic and context dependent. They find that what is required and expected of a leader when all is going smoothly might be very different from what is required or expected in times of crisis or risk. By extension, they propose that in crisis situations, people may not automatically think manager, think male, but may, in fact, be more likely to think crisis, think female, based on the assumption that women possess certain traits that may be useful in times of crisis. Significantly, they define crisis as any form of dramatic reduction in financial and/or reputational well-being that has had an adverse bearing on the perceived state of their organization. It is hard in this context not to think of Yuan Shih, whose surprising appointment to the leadership of the National Gallery in 1977 came at just such a time. Following on the heels of a successful and much-loved director, neither her behavior nor her social identity and scholarly interests as an ethnic Chinese woman and scholar of Asian art met the expectations of her staff, as one leadership theory proposes is required for success. Given the dire state in which the gallery found itself, it is doubtful that a competent white man with the requisite museum experience would have risked his reputation on the job. Yet when Shih left, both the majority of the senior gallery staff who had worked under Boggs and her superiors at the National Museums Corporation placed the blame for her perceived failure on her alone, and not, as they had when Boggs quit, on the impossible circumstances that led to her departure. Even Thomson, who possessed the political antennae and diplomatic skills necessary for success, was subject to negative evaluations from board chair Jean Monty that took no account of the challenging context of the critical first 2 years after the gallery became a Crown Corporation in 1990. The notes she kept at the time of her consultation with the head of human resources, as well as with an employment lawyer, revealed just how precarious she felt her position to be. Monty's departure allowed Thomson to establish a more positive relationship with the Board of Trustees. Nonetheless, her experience illustrates Ryan and Haslam's observation that glass cliffs only increase the factor by which women's competence needs to exceed men's in order for them to succeed, and serves as a reminder of the many additional problems that confront women leaders once they have broken through the glass ceiling. Silva Gelber, one of the few women in Canada in the 1960s to occupy a senior position in the federal bureaucracy as head of the Women's Bureau of the Department of Labor, was one of the early advocates for an expanded role for women. In 1969, she took part in a symposium organized by the Jewish Family and Child Service of Toronto. The theme of the symposium was New Morality, Challenge to Old Values, and the paper she presented was titled The New Role of Women, later published as a pamphlet by the Women's Bureau. I quoted Gelber's concluding remarks in the introduction to this book, and it seems appropriate to revisit them here. Summing up the way forward, she states, there will still remain for women the challenge posed by the traditional prejudices which will take generations to eradicate completely. Certainly, the best weapon in this struggle will be that of women's competence. For by a clear demonstration of competence of a high order, those still nurturing the prejudices of previous ages must eventually be disarmed. To this she adds, women should arm themselves with the education, with the skills, and above all, with a sense of humor most likely to penetrate the wall of intolerance. A sense of humor would certainly help, as high competence is only the beginning. In the complex environment at the higher echelons of the museum world, which have traditionally been harder for women to penetrate, it is easy to become isolated. A trusted network of friends and colleagues is an obvious source of support. The examples of Boggs and Thomson suggest that a clear vision and an inclusive approach to leadership within an organization is equally valuable. Not only does the knowledge thus acquired provide the broader basis for decision making, but it builds loyalty based on shared goals. Active participation in professional organizations offer opportunities to compare and assess solutions to common problems, while knowledgeable contacts in the enabling environment, political, corporate, and private, or a combination of all three, are essential for an awareness of the potential obstacles and opportunities that may delay or advance a leader's goals. Mentorship has a role at both ends of the career spectrum to see where our world has been and where it might head. Beyond these, good luck, good judgment, focus, and stamina will all help, as the example of the three women who led the way as the National Gallery of Canada progressed through the most momentous 30-year period of its history clearly demonstrates. Thank you.
Thank you. That was amazing passage. I hope that through this talk and through the conversation that we've had today, we get a sense of not only your amazing book, but also, the ongoing sort of issues around art museums and cultural institutions with arm's length or instruments, etc. One of the areas that I think also that's really been interesting is just how such a book actually brings not only the richness and the sheer metal and single-mindedness, as you say in the book, of these three women, but also how we as cultural workers have to be that single-minded, I think, in achieving, what we want to do and where we believe we need to be. But I'm going to turn to the questions now, and I there's a lot of questions in here already that I see. But this one is, what is the status of gender parity today in cultural institutions? I'm going to turn that one to you, Alex, because I think you were part of a report on gender disparity in cultural organizations. Do you want to have a go at that? We've got about 7 to 8 minutes for questions, so we'll keep them short, but try and get a few in.
Great. Yeah, I can certainly say that there's no question that non-racialized women are actually dominating leadership roles within galleries and museums across Canada. But I should sort of preface it by saying leadership within institutions, of course, is a larger concept. I mean, it includes the C-suite positions like head curators, chief financial officers, but it also includes governance, right? And so what we're starting to see is that gender parity on board of directors as well within our cultural institutions, and that's really exciting. Of course, where there's more room to grow is within sort of diverse candidates being at the helm of our cultural organization. There's a long way that we need to go there. I will speak to that to the glass ceiling concept a little bit, if I may, because although we do have women dominating the leadership roles, we're still seeing a situation where they're still gaining less in terms of salaries than a lot of their male counterparts. And we're often seeing that, that regional municipal art gallery skill set is not necessarily valued when it comes to some of the largest cultural institutions in Canada. And so often you're seeing them led by male colleagues coming from the United States and the UK. So still room to there's lots of work that we still need to do.
Terrific. There's another question here that I see. There's a couple of questions here. So looking back and the success, failures, and challenges of these women and thinking about contemporary times, what are the critical strategic alliances that women cultural leaders should seek? I'll let you have a go at that. Anyone, actually, Natalie or Diana?
As Sarah knows, I've been retired for a good 10 years. I'm not necessarily working in the field any longer, but I do believe that cultural institution leaders need to really look at leaders of racialized communities right now and enter into dialogue with them, enter into dialogue with indigenous communities. I'll speak to the example of the National Gallery, which I'm more familiar with, where they have instituted a process of close consultation with Indigenous elders in the area, Algonquin area, where the National Gallery stands, of course, on Algonquin territory. And this has been very productive, I think, for them. Apart from these kinds of alliances outside institutions, I think that it's very important for women leaders, any leader, in fact, to bring into the museum at decision-making levels qualified people who do represent the diversity of Canadian society today.
Alex, did you want to add to that?
I certainly echo everything that Diana said. Certainly, what I'm seeing in this code environment is a degree of sharing and collegiality that I have not witnessed before, and I think that that's the beginning of something really interesting and something that I hope in a post-pandemic environment that we're going to see more of, where there's just safe space to talk, that there's real conversations about how to create safety for, in particular, Indigenous and racialized curators and leaders, so that they have a space for success. And so I think that, the fact that we're starting to articulate that and work through strategies around that is extremely exciting, and one of the sort of benefits that I feel is coming out of the pandemic.
Okay, thank you. I think we have, some really interesting questions. We're not going to get to all of them, but there's a couple here, and I think Natalie's posed one right at the beginning that I didn't see until right now. And it's really to everyone, but I think it's a good way to maybe just end our conversation. And it's what would you like to see changed in Canadian cultural policy? And of course, that we don't have a cultural policy per se, but what would this look like? So I think this might be a good question to sort of reflect on and also bring the conversation to a close. So I'll hand it over to you, Diana. Any last comments and any last comments on your book?
I'd like to see a new museum policy from the government. We haven't had one since Flora MacDonald was Minister of Communications in the Mulroney government in 1990. I think it's high time we looked at that again.
Alex?
Again, I have to echo the same thing. Yes, we need a museum policy that isn't just referencing, of course, the national institutions, but that's really recognizing the network of galleries and museums, community centers across Canada, and the role that they're playing. I think that's extremely important. Would love to see that the funding programs are keeping up with the times, and because we know how important that aspect is. I think that would probably be the big ones that I would want to see. And then, of course, Zainab, this is your expertise, so I'd love to hear what you have to say.
Well, I think we've been living in a frozen policy architecture, and clearly that needs to change. And over my many years of reflection and many years of policy work, and critical sort of analysis, I just sort of really want to end on this sort of place where I feel that we really have the agency to reimagine what culture in this country means, and how is Massey implicated in that, or a benefit to that. How can we work with what we've got but really reimagine what it means for us in this country, and how can that be very deeply embedded in the psyche of a nation? Because as we and I've spoken on this, we pointed out that the sort of the idea of culture, and it's not embedded in the Constitution nationally, but if it could be, what would that look like? But just that the public needs to understand the public good of culture, and so what could we do next? But I think it really means coming together in new kinds of ways and new kind of thinking and building that literacy. But thank you so much to both of you, to Natalie, to Massey College, to everyone who took the time to attend and be part of our conversation. And thank you for your work, Diana. Thank you for that book. The country needs it. And we should all feel very empowered by the work you've done and what these three amazing women have done. So with that, I bid you all good night, and hope to meet again soon. Thank you.